The snow in Harlan Creek did not fall the way snow fell in other places. It did not drift down in soft curtains the way it did in Boston, gentle and forgiving, settling on windowsills like powdered sugar on a pastry tray. In Harlan Creek, Montana, the snow came like a verdict. It came sideways off the Beartooth Mountains with a sound like tearing canvas. And it did not stop until it had buried every fence post, every wagon wheel, every foolish ambition that had wandered too far from shelter. The old-timer who drove the stage from Billings to Harlan Creek had told Nora Calloway this as they descended the last switchback before town. His voice, the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had survived enough winters to stop being surprised by them. "Once the pass closes, it closes," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the mules picking their way down the icy ruts. "Usually end of October, sometimes sooner. You get yourself sorted before then, or you don't get sorted at all until April." Nora had nodded as though this information was useful rather than terrifying, and she had tightened her grip on the leather handle of her valise and looked out the smeared window at the town materializing below them. Harlan Creek was smaller than the advertisement in the Boston Courier had implied. The main street was a single corridor of wooden storefronts and a church with a crooked steeple, and the whole thing sat at the bottom of a long valley, like something dropped there and forgotten. Mountains rose on three sides, enormous and indifferent, their upper slopes already white. The valley floor was brown with the last of the autumn grass, and thin columns of wood smoke climbed from a dozen chimneys into the cold gray sky. She had not come here because she wanted to. She had come here because the alternative was remaining in Boston and attending dinner parties where people smiled at her with their mouths while their eyes said things she did not care to repeat to herself. She had been engaged to a man named Edmund Pierce for 14 months. Edmund was handsome and well-connected and had a voice that filled a room the way furniture fills a room with authority and the implication that everything was already arranged. She had believed in him the way you believe in something before you have any reason not to. Then one Tuesday in March, she had gone to his office to surprise him with lunch, and had instead surprised him mid-conversation with a county assessor, the two of them leaning over a map with the comfortable intimacy of men who had made an arrangement that suited them both. The map was of a neighborhood on the south side of the city. Nora recognized three of the street names. Her former students lived on those streets. Their families owned those houses. She had stood in the doorway long enough to understand what she was hearing. Edmund had looked up and seen her face, and for one instant, only one, she had seen something in his eyes that was not affection or guilt, but calculation, the same expression he wore when he was deciding whether a piece of information was worth acting on. Then the smile had come back warm and practiced, and he had started to explain. She had not waited for the explanation. The stage pulled into the street, and the driver set the brake with a sound like a gunshot, and Nora climbed down before he offered to help her boots finding the mud of Harlan Creek for the first time. It was cold. Genuinely, specifically cold, the kind that moved through wool, as though wool were nothing that found the gap between her collar and her hair and settled there with intent. She set her valise down and straightened her back and looked at the town. Three men on the wooden boardwalk to her left had stopped their conversation to look at her. A woman across the street paused in the act of hanging a sign and looked at her. A boy of perhaps 12, sitting on a barrel near the general store, looked at her with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who had not yet learned to pretend otherwise. Nora looked back at all of them with a pleasantness she had spent years perfecting and picked up her valise. The town hall was a single-story building 2 doors down from the church. Inside, 3 men sat at a table that was too large for the room. They introduced themselves as the members of the school board, and they shook her hand with the slightly surprised formality of men who had agreed to hire a school teacher and were now reckoning with the reality of one standing in front of them, the chairman. A square-faced man named Alderman Birch had a beard that moved when he talked, and the deliberate manner of someone who had learned that deliberateness impressed people. "Miss Calloway," he said, spreading a piece of paper on the table, "we use the boarding around system here. You'll stay a month at a time with different families in the district. The hosting family provides room and board, and you provide evening instruction to their children when needed in exchange." "I understand," Nora said. "First placement is the Rourke property." Birch said this the way you might say a word, in a language you were not entirely comfortable speaking, with a slight hesitation before it and a slight relief after it. "It's the furthest out, 7 miles up the North Valley Road." The second board member, a thin man named Prewitt, cleared his throat and examined his hands. The third said nothing but shifted in his chair. "Is there something about the Rourke property I should know?" Nora asked. The 3 men exchanged a look that lasted a precise half-second too long. "Caleb Rourke is a private man," Birch said finally. "Keeps to himself. You'll find him a bit, that is to say, he's not much for." He stopped and started again. "The ranch is well maintained and the accommodations will be adequate." He submitted the request for a teacher himself, through an intermediary. Prewitt added as though this were relevant. "He requested a teacher himself," Nora repeated. "Then I expect we'll manage." The board looked at her with expressions that suggested they were not entirely convinced of this, but were professionally obligated to proceed as though they were. Caleb Rourke arrived at the hall at 3 in the afternoon. Nora heard him before she saw him, not his voice, but the particular quality of silence that preceded him through the door, the way people in the hall stopped what they were doing and rearranged themselves slightly without being aware of doing it. He came through the doorway without ducking, but only barely. A man built on a scale that seemed calibrated for outdoors rather than indoors, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes not from deliberate effort, but from years of work that required it. He wore a heavy canvas coat the color of old bark, and boots that had seen more winters than Nora had been alive to witness. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and his jaw was covered in several days of beard that was not quite deliberate and not quite careless. His eyes were the precise gray of the sky over the mountains outside, and they found her immediately and assessed her with the unhurried efficiency of a man looking at a fence line for weak points. He looked at her the way you look at a problem. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was low and a little rough, like the first sound a door makes after a long winter. "Mr. Rourke," she said. That appeared to conclude the introductions. He picked up her trunk with one hand in a way that made it look like something other than the 90-pound object it was and turned toward the door. She followed him out to a wagon hitched to 2 horses, dark bays, with the well-muscled quiet of animals that had been worked properly and long. He set her trunk in the wagon bed and climbed to the seat. By the time she had gathered her valise and skirts, he was already holding the reins. She climbed up on her own. The road north out of Harlan Creek followed a creek bed, the water running low and clear and very cold between banks that were beginning to harden with frost. On either side, the land opened into grassland dotted with sage, and beyond that, the hills rose in long, sweeping lines toward the mountains. The sky was the particular luminous gray of an overcast afternoon in October. The light sourceless and even and cold. The mules. She corrected herself. The horses moved at a pace that was efficient rather than leisurely, and Caleb Rourke held the reins loosely and did not speak. Nora watched the landscape. She asked after a period she estimated at 12 minutes how much further they had to travel. 3 hours, he said without looking at her. Then, after a pause that suggested he had considered whether to add anything and decided minimally in favor of it, "The road gets worse after the creek crossing." "Thank you," she said. He said nothing. She tried again at the creek crossing when the wagon lurched and the cold spray came up off the rocks, and she grabbed the seat rail. "The mountains are beautiful," she said. "They are," he said. "Do they have names? These specific ones?" He glanced at them briefly. "Beartooth Range. That one north is what locals call the Widow's Shoulder." He paused. Don't know who named it. It was the longest sequence of sentences he had produced since they met. She decided not to push her luck. The road did get worse after the creek crossing, narrowing to a rutted track that wound up through stands of aspen, already bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Then through dense, dark corridors of pine where the light dropped and the temperature dropped with it, and the smell of pine resin was sharp enough to taste. And then, as they came around a long bend in the track and the trees opened up, she saw the valley. It spread below and ahead of them like something from a different scale of reality. The mountains here formed a rough bowl, and in the bottom of the bowl lay a valley floor of dried grass and frost, divided by the dark thread of a stream. There were cattle in the lower pasture, small dark shapes against the pale ground. The ranch buildings sat at the far end, solid and low, arranged with the practical logic of people who understood that beauty and function were not separate considerations. And there at the northern edge of the property, perhaps 300 yards from the main house, was a structure. It was unfinished. She could see that clearly, even from this distance, the raw bones of it, vertical timbers and horizontal beams, a floor, but no walls yet completed a partial roof frame open to the sky. Lumber was stacked nearby in neat rows. It was the size of a small building rather than a fence or a barn. And the framing had a deliberateness to it that spoke of someone who knew what they were building. "What is that?" she asked, nodding toward it. Caleb followed her gaze. Something in his posture shifted, barely the way a door shifts when there is wind on the other side of it. "Storage," he said. It was not, she thought, storage, but she filed the information away and said nothing. The cabin was not what she had expected. She had not. She realized upon reflection known quite what she expected, but it was not this. It was solidly built, the logs fitted with precision, the chinking recent and tight, the porch wrapped around two sides with a railing made of peeled pine that had been sanded smooth. A woodpile ran the full length of the east wall, stacked in a geometry that suggested the person who had stacked it considered disorder a form of failure. The yard was clean. The barn beyond was large and well-maintained, and from it came the comfortable sounds of horses and the smell of hay, and animals, and the particular warm smell of a place that is properly kept. Caleb lifted her trunk from the wagon and carried it inside. She followed. The main room was large by the standards of what she had been told to expect. A stone fireplace occupied most of the far wall, and in front of it lay a braided rug in dark reds and browns. A heavy table sat in the center of the room, with 4 chairs, though she had been given to understand that only one person lived here. 2 oil lamps were mounted on the wall, and a third sat on the table. A kitchen area occupied the near corner with a cast-iron stove and shelves of provisions, organized with the same careful logic as the woodpile outside. There were no decorations on the walls. There were no curtains on the windows. The room was clean in the specific way that a room becomes clean when one person has been living in it alone for a long time and has made peace with spareness. In the corner by the window stood a small desk. On the desk was a single item, a thin notebook, dark brown leather, its spine cracked from use. Caleb set her trunk at the foot of a door off the main room. "Your room," he said. "There's a chamber pot and a basin. Water's in the barrel by the stove." He moved to the fireplace and crouched to lay a fire, his hands moving with the automatic efficiency of long habit kindling, first, then the split pine, the strike of the match. "You can cook." "Yes," she said. "Provisions are on the shelves. I eat at 6. He stood. "The north pasture and the building in the corner of the property are off limits. Everything else on the property, you can go where you need to." He looked at her once directly, that gray assessment again. "Any questions?" "Not at the moment," she said. He nodded. He took his coat from the hook by the door and put it back on. "I'll be in the barn," he said, and went out. She stood alone in the center of the room and listened to the fire beginning to catch, and the wind picking up outside the walls, and the distant sound of cattle, and the sharp smell of pine and wood smoke. Somewhere in the north corner of the property was a structure that was not storage. On the desk in the corner was a notebook worn soft with handling. And in the barn was a man who had answered her question about the building with a word that did not fit what she had seen. She put on her apron and began to look for the beans. Dinner was salt pork and beans and cornbread from a recipe she had memorized from her mother's handwriting on a card that was now somewhere in her valise. She set 2 plates on the table at 6, and Caleb came in at 2 minutes past, washed his hands at the basin, and sat. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who ate because fuel was necessary. He did not look at his food with any particular pleasure. He also did not look at it with displeasure. He simply processed it. "The cornbread is good," he said when he had finished it. "Thank you," she said. He pushed his plate back and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had made. He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at the fire. He did not look at her in a way that suggested discomfort or hostility, but simply in a way that suggested he did not as a practice. Look at people when there was nothing that needed to be communicated. "I'll start classes in the old Prewitt storage barn tomorrow," Nora said. "Mr. Birch said it was available." "It's available," he confirmed. "I'll need to understand the boarding schedule for the students. How many children are in the district?" 14, 3 from the Holt family. 2 Garrity children, the rest scattered. He stood, carried his plate to the basin, washed it, set it on the shelf. "I can give you a map tomorrow morning. The Holt boy knows the valley well. He can ride with you the first week if you need a guide." "That would be helpful," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and moved toward the door that led to what she assumed was his own room. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame and said without turning around, "The north pasture. And the building." "I heard you," she said. "Good," he said, and went through. She sat at the table in the firelight and poured herself the last of the coffee and held the cup in both hands. From somewhere outside, faint and rhythmic against the rising wind, came a sound. She lifted her head and listened. It was the sound of a hammer, or perhaps a mallet steady and deliberate striking wood. It came from the direction of the north pasture. It was past 10 o'clock. She drank her coffee and went to bed, and lay in the dark and listened to the sound continue until sometime after midnight, when it stopped. She lay awake a while longer, looking at the ceiling in the dark, thinking about a building that was not storage, and a man who worked on it in secret after he thought everyone was asleep. The first real fight happened on the 4th day. Nora had been at the Prewitt barn from 7 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and she had come back to the ranch with a list of things she needed: chalk and a proper slate board, and a reader appropriate for children who had never seen a city, and a map of the United States that was not 15 years out of date. She needed to go to town. She needed to go to town today, because the supply wagon from Billings came through Harlan Creek only on Thursdays, and this was Wednesday, and if she missed it, she would wait another week. She found Caleb at the corral running a new length of rope through a fence post, with the patient attention of a man who considered the integrity of a fence post a matter of some importance. She explained what she needed. She asked if she could take one of the horses. He did not look up from the rope. "No," he said. She waited a moment to see if there was more. There was not. "I need to get to town before tomorrow morning," she said. "The supply wagon." "I know when the supply wagon comes." He pulled the rope taut, tested it, found it acceptable. "The east trail iced over last night. Bottom of the switchback is glazed solid. A horse that doesn't know that section of road will go down." "Then I'll walk carefully." He looked at her then, not with anger, not quite, with the particular expression of a man confronting something that should not require explanation but apparently does. 7 miles, he said, on an ice trail, in those boots. She looked down at her boots. They were good boots, Boston boots. She looked back up. "I am not asking your permission," she said. "I am asking to borrow a horse, And I am telling you, the East Trail is not safe. You don't know what I'm capable of. I know what ice does to a horse that hits it wrong, he said. Doesn't matter what you're capable of. Matters what the ice is capable of. He went back to the rope. Holt is going to town Friday. He can bring your supplies. Obese. Friday is too late for the supply wagon. Then Friday is too late. He said this without inflection, without apology, without the slightest indication that he understood why this was not a satisfying answer. Nora stood at the corral fence for a moment and felt the specific anger that comes not from cruelty, but from a person who is entirely certain they are right, and has not considered that certainty itself might be the problem. She turned and walked back toward the house and went inside and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the mountains and breathed slowly until the flush in her face subsided. Behind her, the door opened. She did not turn around. It was not Caleb. The footsteps were lighter, accompanied by the particular jingle of spurs worn by someone young enough to still find them enjoyable. She turned to find a young man of perhaps 22 standing just inside the door, hat in hand, with a sunburned face and honest eyes and the expression of someone who had been sent to deliver information they were not entirely sure would be welcome. "Miss Calloway," he said. "I'm Tom Holt. I work the north pasture." He nodded toward the corral, visible through the window. "I couldn't help but overhear." "I imagine not," she said. "He's right about the trail," Tom said with the apologetic directness of someone who felt that honesty and manners were both important, but honesty came first. "Went down it this morning. My mare slipped twice on the flat section, and she knows that road better than I do." He turned his hat in his hands. "But I can ride into town this afternoon and pick up whatever you need if you give me a list." "I was going anyway. I just hadn't mentioned it to anyone." She looked at him for a moment. "You're very kind," she said. He shrugged with the practiced casualness of someone deflecting a compliment they were pleased by. "The last teacher we had was old Mr. Fenwick. He was 73, and he smelled like camphor, and he believed mathematics was a form of moral instruction. My youngest sister is 8 years old, and she's been waiting 2 years for a real school." He put his hat back on. "I'll take your list." "What?" She wrote him a list. He took it and went out. She heard him stop in the yard and exchange a few words with Caleb too low to make out. A pause. Then Tom's boots on the frozen ground going toward the barn. She looked out the window and found Caleb looking back at the house. When he saw her at the window, he looked away, again back at the rope. She did not know then what Tom had said to him. She found out 3 days later when Tom told her with the slightly guilty pleasure of someone sharing a story that was too good to keep. He had told Caleb that the last teacher had lasted 6 weeks before the isolation and the silence drove him to drink and then to Billings. Tom had told Caleb that this one was different, that he could see it, and that it might be worth treating her like a person rather than a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. Caleb had responded to this assessment with a long silence, and then the single word "fine," after which he had gone back to his rope. It was not an apology. But that evening at dinner he pushed the salt across the table toward her before she reached for it, and she chose to accept this in the spirit she believed it was intended. The accident happened on a Tuesday 11 days into her time at the ranch. She was in the barn lot beside the pre-wit building helping the older Garrity's girl demonstrate long division on the back of a feed sack she had hung against the wall for lack of a proper slate when she heard the sound. It was a sharp, brief, wrongly pitched cry from somewhere behind the building, followed by a heavier thud and then silence of the specific kind that follows something going badly. She was around the corner of the building before she had consciously decided to move. Daniel Hold, Tom's younger brother, 9 years old and possessed of the confidence that comes from being the youngest of 3 and surviving. It had climbed the top rail of the adjacent corral fence to retrieve a hat that had blown up there and had come down incorrectly. He was on the ground on his back, his right arm at an angle that made Nora's stomach drop. and a cut above his left ear bleeding with the bright, alarming generosity that scalp wounds produce. He was conscious, which was something, but his face was the color of old linen, and he was making a sound low in his throat that was worse than crying. "Don't move," Nora said, kneeling beside him. "Daniel, look at me. Don't move your arm." "My arm," he said. "I know. Don't move it." She looked up. The older children had gathered in a half circle at a distance of approximately the distance you stand when something frightening has happened and you are not sure what your role is. "Thomas," she said to the oldest Garrity boy, 14 and steady, "run to the main house. Get Mr. Rourke." Thomas ran. She kept her hand on Daniel's shoulder, talking to him, keeping his eyes on her face, not on his arm. She had seen a broken bone once before her father's wrist, the winter he was 42, and the ice got him on the porch steps. She knew that the looking was sometimes worse than the thing itself. She knew to keep him still, and warm and talking. She did not know Caleb had arrived until his shadow fell across them both. She looked up. He was already crouching on Daniel's other side, his coat gone, his sleeves pushed up despite the cold, his hands moving with a quietness and precision that she had not seen in any context other than fence posts and rope. He checked the boy's pupils. He ran his fingers along the arm with a lightness that seemed implausible, given the size of his hands. He pressed gently at the wrist and the elbow and asked Daniel 3 questions in a low, level voice. Where did it hurt? Most, did he feel anything in his fingers? Could he wiggle them? Daniel answered all 3. "Green stick fracture," Caleb said. He was not talking to her exactly. He was talking to the information organizing it. "Clean, won't need setting, needs to be splinted and kept still." He looked up at Thomas Garrity. 2 straight pieces of wood from the pile by the door. "About so long." He measured with his hands. "And something to bind them. Your belt if you haven't got rope." Thomas went. Caleb looked at Nora across the boy. "Hold his shoulder," he said. "Right hand flat. Keep the pressure even. Don't let him roll." She did exactly what he said. He worked quickly, the splint assembled, and applied with a competence that was absolutely without performance, without the self-consciousness of someone demonstrating skill. It was simply what needed doing, and he did it. When it was finished, he sat back on his heels and told Daniel he had done well, which was true, and that Tom would take him home. Which was a plan rather than a certainty, but delivered as a certainty because that was what the situation required. Tom arrived from the north pasture at a half-run 7 minutes later and took his brother up in front of him on his horse and rode for their family's homestead 3 miles east. Caleb stood and watched them go. Then he walked to the water trough at the edge of the lot and plunged both hands in and held them there a moment, washing the blood from them. When he lifted them out and reached for the rag he had tucked in his belt, she saw it. His hands were shaking. Not violently, not even enough that someone who had not been watching closely would notice. But she had been watching closely for 11 days, and she saw it. His large, capable, precise hands shaking with a tremor that he controlled within seconds, pressing them flat against his thighs until they stilled. She looked away before he could see her looking. When the students had been sent home early, and the barn lot was quiet, and the cold was coming down off the mountains with the particular weight it carried. In the late afternoon, she walked back to the ranch house and began to make coffee. She heard him come in 20 minutes later. She heard him hang his coat. She heard the chair pull back at the table. She poured 2 cups and brought them both to the table and sat down across from him. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for Daniel." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "He'll be fine." I mean for knowing what to do." She paused. "You've done that before." He was quiet for a moment. The fire was low and needed a log, but neither of them moved toward it. "Army," he said, "field medicine. You learn it or you watch men die of things that didn't have to kill them." "How long were you in?" He turned his cup slightly on the table. 4 years. 61 to 65. The war. She understood the math. He would have been very young. Where? Tennessee, mostly. End of it, Georgia. He looked at the fire. It was a long time ago. She wanted to ask more. She could feel the shape of what she wanted to ask, the specific questions that would open rather than close the conversation. But she had learned enough in 11 days to know the difference between a door that was open and a door that had simply been left unlocked, and she was not yet sure which this was. "Where did you learn to be a rancher?" she asked instead. Something in him settled slightly. This was apparently a safer road. "My father's place, Colorado. I came up here in '75 with enough money to buy the land and the time to build on it." "You built the house yourself?" "Most of it. Holt's father helped with the roof." He drank his coffee. "The barn took 2 summers." "It's good work," she said, and then, because the thought had been in her mind for 11 days and seemed now like a reasonable thing to say out loud, "The building in the north, the one you work on at night, that's good work too, from what I can see at a distance." The room changed, not dramatically. The fire still burned low, and the coffee was still hot, and the mountains outside the window were still where they had been. But the quality of the silence shifted, became something different. A silence with more weight to it, more attention. He looked at her across the table. His gray eyes held an expression she had not seen in them before and could not immediately name. "I told you that area was off-limits," he said. "You did. I've respected that. I'm telling you what I can see from the south pasture fence, which is where I'm allowed to be." A long pause. His jaw moved slightly, as though he were trying out several responses and discarding them. Finally, he said, "It's not storage." "I know," she said. He looked at his cup. He looked at the fire. He said nothing else. But he also did not leave the table, and they sat there in the firelight while the wind picked up outside and the coffee cooled in their cups, and the silence between them became for the first time something that felt less like a wall and more like a shared room. Silas Drum's man arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Nora had come to the ranch. He came on a good horse, which was the first thing she noticed, because good horses in this country were a form of information. He was a compact, precise man in a town coat that was wrong for the weather, with pale eyes and the careful manners of someone who had been trained to deliver unpleasant things pleasantly. His name was Hargrove, and he asked for Mr. Rourke at the door with the particular courtesy of a man who expected to be invited in. Caleb received him in the yard. Nora was on the porch with her lesson planning, and she did not move from her chair. "Mr. Drum has asked me to convey his continued interest in the North Valley property," Hargrove said. He had his hands folded in front of him like a man in church. He's prepared to improve his previous offer by 15%. He feels it reflects the true value of the land more accurately. "His previous offer was below value," Caleb said. 15% above that is still below value. "Mr. Drum understands you have certain sentimental attachments to the property." "I don't have sentimental attachments. I have a ranch." Hargrove smiled the smile of a man who had been told to be patient. "The situation in this valley, Mr. Rourke, is such that ranching alone becomes increasingly difficult without access to reliable water. Mr. Drum is simply in a position to offer you a comfortable exit before that difficulty becomes more pronounced." "The water in this valley comes from my land," Caleb said. "It's been coming from my land for 7 years. Any difficulty with water access in this valley is a difficulty Mr. Drum created, and Mr. Drum can resolve." He looked at Hargrove with an expression that was entirely without heat and entirely without compromise. "Tell him no." Hargrove held the smile for a moment longer than was natural. Then let it go. Mr. Drum had hoped for a more productive conversation. "You've had a productive conversation," Caleb said. "You know where I stand." After Hargrove rode out, Caleb stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the track the horse had made in the frost. Then he turned and went into the barn without looking at the porch. Tom Holt appeared from somewhere near the fence, wiping his hands on his trousers, watching the road with an expression that had gone flat and watchful. He glanced up at Nora. "Third time this year," he said. "He keeps coming back," she said. "He does." Tom looked at the barn door. "Caleb's the last one. Everyone else in the North Valley sold or got pushed out. Peterson gave up last winter after his herds lost 30 head to thirst. Morrison after that. The Garrity place is the only other one left, and they're south of the creek, so Drum can't touch their water." Tom folded his arms against the cold. "If Caleb sells, Drum controls every drop of water from the Beartooth down to Harlan Creek. He can charge whatever he wants for access. Can cut off anyone who argues. Can he do that legally?" Tom looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has lived long enough in a place to find the word legally faintly amusing. "He's got a judge in his pocket in Billings," he said. "He's got the county assessor. He's got 3 lawyers and more money than anyone in this territory will see in a lifetime." He picked up a fence post he had been carrying and moved toward the corral. "What he doesn't have," he said over his shoulder, "is Caleb Rourke's signature on a deed, and Caleb Rourke's signature is not something you get by offering him money." That evening, alone in her room, Nora took out a sheet of paper and wrote a long letter to a clerk she had known in Boston, a young man who had worked in the county records office and who owed her a professional courtesy she had never collected. She told him what she needed. She described the kind of documentation she was looking for. She folded the letter and addressed it and put it in her coat pocket to give to Tom for the Thursday post, and she lay down and looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about a man with pale eyes and a town coat who smiled when he should have been uncomfortable. She had seen that smile before. In Boston, on a man named Edmund Pierce. She knew what it meant when a man who was taking something from you was polite about it. The mornings changed first. She did not notice it happening, which was perhaps the point. It was not a decision either of them made, or if it was the kind of decision that disguises itself as habit until it is too late to undo. It began with the coffee. On the 16th day, she came out of her room at 6:30 to find a cup already poured and sitting at her place at the table, steam rising from it in the cold air of the not yet fully warmed cabin. Caleb was at the door, pulling on his coat, his back to her. He did not say anything about the coffee. She did not say anything about the coffee. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup, and he went out. The next morning the cup was there again. On the third morning she got up 20 minutes earlier and made biscuits and left 2 on a plate at his end of the table, covered with a cloth to keep them warm. She was in her room pinning up her hair when she heard him come in from the barn, heard the particular quality of silence that meant he had found something unexpected, and then the sound of the chair and the small sounds of eating. When she came out, the plate was empty and washed and back on the shelf. They did not discuss any of this. What they had instead was a geometry of small adjustments, each one plausibly deniable as anything other than practical, each one shifting the arrangement between them by some increment too small to name. He began to wait until she was at the table before he started eating, not because she had asked him to, but because at some point it had become the natural order of things. She began to save him the corner piece of whatever she baked, not because she had considered doing so, but because she had noticed without meaning to that he always reached for the corner when she did not save it, and there was something that felt like care in the act of reaching first. The kitchen was narrow. This was a fact of the architecture rather than a choice, but it meant that 2 people moving through it at the same time required a certain negotiation of space, a sideways step here, a hand on the back of a chair there, a pause to let someone pass. On the 22nd day, she was reaching for the flour canister on the high shelf and could not quite get it, and he was behind her and reached past her shoulder and set it on the counter without being asked, his arm close enough to her that she could feel the warmth of it, and for a moment neither of them moved, and the kitchen was very small and very quiet, and the fire in the stove made the only sound in the room. Then he stepped back and she measured out the flour, and the moment was filed away in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not ready to examine. She had been at the ranch for 26 days when she found the notebook. She had not been looking for it. She had been cleaning the table, which in this cabin meant wiping it down with a damp cloth and straightening the few things on it, the lamp, the ink pot, the 2 books that were there when she arrived, and had not moved. The notebook was tucked behind one of the books in a way that suggested it lived there in that specific position reliably and by long habit. When the cloth caught the edge of it and pulled it slightly into view, she did not mean to look at it, and then she was looking at it. The cover was dark brown leather worn to softness at the corners. The spine was cracked in the way that things crack when they have been opened many times. She should have pushed it back behind the book and gone on with her cleaning. She opened it instead. The handwriting was not what she expected. She had expected something like his speech, abbreviated, functional, stripped of anything unnecessary. Instead, the letters were careful and deliberate. Each one fully formed the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write by someone who considered it worth doing properly. There were 9 names on the first page, written in a column with a small space between each. She read them without meaning to. Aldridge, Coombs, Fletcher, DeLuca, Park, Harrington, Webb, Sims, Graves. Below each name was a line of text. She read one before she made herself stop. Below the name Aldridge it said, "From Ohio, had a younger sister named May, could identify every bird in Tennessee by its call." She closed the notebook. She put it back exactly where she had found it, in the precise position it had been in behind the second book spine, facing in. She finished wiping the table. She went to the stove and put another log on, even though the fire was fine as it was, and stood looking into the flames for a long time. 9 names, 9 lines of text, not military citations, not dates of death. The names of birds a man from Ohio could identify by their calls. Outside from the direction of the north pasture came the sound of hammering clear and rhythmic in the cold morning air. The storm arrived on a Wednesday evening in the first week of November, without much warning, which was apparently its habit. Tom had told her in the first week that the Beartooth storms came down fast, that you could have a clear sky at noon and be buried to the windowsills by midnight, and that the first one of the season was always the worst because you had almost convinced yourself that winter had agreed to wait another week. She was in her room grading the arithmetic exercises she had set for the older students when she became aware that the light had changed. She went to the window. The sky to the north was the specific dark that is not the dark of evening but the dark of weather, a bruised and moving dark, and the mountains had disappeared into it entirely. The wind, which had been present all day, in the low, constant way of late autumn wind, was picking up and picking up quickly. She could hear it in the pines on the hillside above the cabin, a sound like a crowd of people, all drawing breath at once. She put down her papers and went to the main room and put 2 large logs on the fire, and filled the water pot and the kettle, and set them on the stove. She had grown up in Boston, which had weather, but this was something different in kind, not merely degree. This was weather that had intentions. By 8 o'clock the snow was coming sideways past the windows thick and fast, and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped 4 inches on the thermometer by the door, despite the fire. She put on her heavier shawl and moved her chair closer to the hearth and listened to the storm establishing itself around the building with the focused, systematic energy of something building something. By 10 o'clock Caleb had not come in. She told herself this was not a problem. He was in the barn, which was solid and well insulated and stocked with hay and water. He had survived however many winters on this mountain without her being concerned about him. He did not need her to be concerned about him. She put another log on the fire. By 11, she put on her coat and her boots and her heaviest scarf. and opened the back door. The cold hit her like a flat surface. She gasped and leaned into it and pulled the door shut behind her and made for the barn, following the rope line she had noticed strung between the cabin and the barn door and had until this moment not fully understood the purpose of. She understood it now. The snow was so thick and the wind so loud that without the rope she would have had, she estimated, approximately 40 seconds before she was lost in a space she could cross in 20 steps on a clear day. She found the barn door by touch and hauled it open against the wind and fell inside and pulled it shut. The barn was warm in the way that only a barn full of large animals is warm, a deep organic warmth that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with bodies and breath and hay. 3 horses in the left stalls turned their heads toward her. The mule in the far stall did not bother. And at the end of the center aisle, in the last stall on the right, Caleb was crouched in the straw beside his mare Ida. The gray one, the oldest one, the one he rode on his own rather than the working horses. Ida was in distress. Even Nora, who had not grown up around horses and knew them primarily as large and occasionally willful, could see that. The mare was down on her side, her breathing heavy and labored, her great sides heaving in a rhythm that was wrong, too slow and too effortful. She was sweating despite the cold. And the sound she was making was low and continuous and the kind of sound that animals make when they are past impatience and into endurance. Caleb looked up when Nora came in. Whatever he had expected to come through that door, it was apparently not her, because his expression moved through surprise, and something else, something that might have been relief before it settled back into its customary stillness. "Go back inside," he said. "What's wrong with her? Foal is positioned wrong. Go back inside." "I've helped a calf come right," she said, which was true once on her aunt's farm in Connecticut when she was 15, and the farmer had talked her through it because he had needed a second pair of hands. She came down the aisle and crouched on the other side of the mare from him. "Tell me what you need." He looked at her across the horse's heaving side. Whatever calculation he was doing was brief. "I need her to stay calm," he said. "Talk to her. Keep your hand on her neck right here and talk to her. She responds to voices." "What should I say?" "Doesn't matter. The tone is what she's listening to." So Nora talked. She talked about Boston in the spring, about the common, when the elms came in, about the harbor, on a clear day, when the light came off the water in a way that made you feel that something good was possible. She talked about her classroom at the school she had taught at for 2 years, the way the chalk dust hung in the afternoon light. She talked in the low, steady, purposeful voice she used with her youngest students when something had frightened them. Ida's breathing stayed heavy, but her thrashing stilled, and Caleb worked with the focused, unhurried concentration of someone who understood that panic was a luxury neither of them could afford. It took 2 hours. She did not track the time precisely. She was aware of it passing, the way you are aware of cold as a fact of the environment rather than something you are counting. At some point she had moved from crouching to sitting in the straw, her back against the stall wall, one hand still on Ida's neck. At some point Caleb had taken his coat off and his flannel shirt was dark with sweat and effort. At some point the snow outside had reached a pitch of fury that made the barn walls flex and the horses in the other stalls move uneasily, and the only light was the 2 lanterns hanging from the center beam, swaying slightly in the drafts, throwing their warm, doubled shadows across the straw. The foal arrived at 1:30 in the morning. It arrived in the way that things arrive after long effort, with a sudden definitive quality, as though it had simply been waiting for everyone to stop holding their breath. It was small and dark, and it moved with the uncoordinated urgency of something that had been waiting a long time to move. Caleb cleared its face and stepped back, and Ida, exhausted but transformed, lifted her head and began the low, methodical work of recognizing what she had made. Nora became aware that she had been holding her own breath. She let it out slowly. The barn was very quiet suddenly, Or perhaps it had always been quiet, and she had only just noticed the storm still there, but outside the inside of the stall having become its own separate world with its own interior weather. Caleb sat back on his heels in the straw across from her. He was, she realized, as tired as she had ever seen a person. The exhaustion that is not the exhaustion of effort, but the exhaustion of sustained attention, of holding everything steady for a long time. He looked at the foal, and then at Ida, and then for a moment at nothing in particular. Then he looked at her. In the lantern light, his face was different than it was in the daylight or the firelight of the cabin. The angles were the same, but the light was warmer, and it sat in the lines around his eyes and his mouth, and made them into something that was not hardness, had perhaps never been hardness. Might have always been a particular kind of care, worn into the surface of a face by long use. "You should have stayed inside," he said. "Yes," she agreed. A pause. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. They sat in the straw in the lantern light while Ida tended to the small new thing she had made, and the storm continued outside, and neither of them moved toward the door. The night had the specific stillness of a night that has been difficult and is now finished, being difficult a stillness with some warmth in it. "Tomorrow," he said at last. His voice was low, roughened by the long night. "I want to show you something." She looked at him. "The north pasture?" she asked. He looked at the foal. "Yes," he said. She did not sleep for a long time after she finally went in. She lay in the dark and listened to the storm winding down above the cabin roof, and thought about a man who talked to 9 dead men in a notebook, and built things at night that he was not ready to name in daylight, and felt the specific inconvenience, entirely unwelcome warmth of someone beginning to understand another person against their better intentions. The snow was knee-deep and still settling in the blue early light when he came to the back door and knocked once. She was already dressed. She had been dressed for 20 minutes, sitting at the table with her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, not reading the paper she had opened in front of her. She followed him out into the cold. He did not speak on the walk across the south pasture and through the gate and up the long field toward the north corner. She did not speak either. The snow was unmarked ahead of them, pristine and even, and their footsteps broke through the crust with a soft, repetitive sound. The morning was very clear after the storm, the sky a hard, brilliant blue, the light coming off the snow with an intensity that made her eyes ache. The mountains were freshly white and enormous, and close-seeming in the cold air. She saw it before they reached it. She had seen it from a distance through the south pasture fence in the evenings in snow and in the last of the autumn light. But she had not understood what it was until she was close enough to see the lintel. It was a building, a proper building framed and walled and floored its bones of thick-cut pine, standing solid and square in the snow. The walls were up and chinked, not finished, but structurally complete. The roof frame was there, the rafters cut and pegged open to the sky on one side, where the boarding had not yet been laid, but waiting the structure ready for the final covering. 2 windows, their frames already set and squared face south to catch the winter light. And above the door, carved into the lintel, with letters that were careful and deliberate, the same handwriting as the notebook, Harlan Creek School. She stood in front of it for a long time. She was aware of him standing beside her, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the building rather than at her. The cold was significant. Neither of them moved toward the door. The morning light fell through the open roof and lay in bright rectangles on the unfinished floor inside, and she could see where the floorboards had been laid and sanded smooth all the way to the walls. Not a rough floor for storage, but a finished floor for standing on. "You built this, she said. "Building it," he said. "Roof's not done. Need another week of clear weather. You nailed the sign before you finished the roof." A pause. "Wanted to know what it looked like," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the lintel. The morning light was very clear on his face. "You submitted the application for a teacher," she said, "through an intermediary so the board wouldn't know it came from you, Te. Didn't want them telling me I needed to finish the building first. Would have taken 2 more years waiting on their schedule. You were going to tell them when it was done." "When it was done," he agreed. "Caleb." She said his name the way she had come to say it in the past few weeks, without the careful neutrality of the first days, without its being a professional form of address. He looked at her then. "Why?" she asked. "Why a school?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking back at the building. The wind moved through the open roof and made a low sound across the rafters. "The Holt children," he said finally. "Garrity children. The Morrison children before they left. There are 14 children in this valley, and the nearest school is in Harlan Creek, and in winter they can't get there." He stopped. He started again. "There's no reason a child should grow up not knowing things just because of where they happen to be born." He said this in the flat, considered tone of a man stating a position he had thought about for a long time. Then he was quiet again. She looked at the school. She looked at the lintel. She thought about 9 names in a notebook, and a man who worked in the dark before dawn on something he had not told anyone about. She thought about what it means to make a thing as a way of addressing something that has no other address. "Tom told me you've been up here 7 years, she said. 7 years in March. You started building this when—" A pause. 4 years ago, he said. "Framed the floor the first summer. Took it slow, she. 4 years. Alone, before there was anyone to see it or approve it or call it a good idea." She thought about that for a moment, the specific quality of doing something for 4 years without external confirmation that it was worth doing, sustained by something that did not require an audience. She stepped through the doorway into the school. Inside, the air smelled of cut pine and sawdust and cold, clean air through the open roof. The floor was smooth under her boots. The 2 windows gave a view south down the long valley, the creek a dark line in the snow, the mountains rising beyond. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, measuring it. It was the right size. Not large, not ambitious, beyond what was needed, but the right size for 14 children and a teacher, and the kind of learning that happens when you are not distracted by discomfort. She turned back to the doorway. He was standing just outside it, one hand on the frame watching her. "It's a good school," she said. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before, small and quickly contained, but there. He looked down at his boots and then back at her and said, "Roof should be done before the next storm." He paused. "If you're still here." Oh, she looked at him. "My contract is 6 months," she said. "I know what your contract is." "Then you know I'll still be here." He nodded once and stepped back from the doorway and turned toward the south pasture. She came out after him, and they walked back through the snow in the clear winter light. Their footsteps tracking a doubled line through the white field, and somewhere above them a hawk moved in a long, lazy arc against the hard blue sky, and neither of them spoke. And the silence between them had changed into something else entirely. Something she did not yet have a name for, but felt the weight and warmth of solid as the pine walls of the school behind them. On the walk back, he told her one thing, not as a story, not as an explanation. Just one thing in the flat tone of someone reading a single sentence aloud from a document. "There were 9 men in my unit," he said, "at Kennesaw Mountain. I gave the order to advance on a position I had been told was clear." He stopped. He started again. It was not clear. She walked beside him and did not say anything, and did not look at him, because she understood that some things are said into the middle distance and not into a face, and that the courtesy of the listener is sometimes to simply be present without requiring acknowledgement of that presence. 2 men came back, he said. I was one of them. The cabin was ahead of them, smoke rising from the chimney into the blue sky. She could hear one of the horses in the barn, a soft, low sound. Inside the foal was warm and new in the straw. 7 years is a long time to carry something alone, she said quietly to the middle distance. He did not answer, but when they reached the porch and he held the door for her, she thought she felt, in that small, unremarkable gesture, something that had not been there when they had walked out. She asked him about the notebook on a Sunday evening in the 3rd week of November, when the snow was 2 feet deep in the yard, and the temperature had dropped far enough that the window glass had grown a fine crystalline fur on the inside, and the fire needed tending every 2 hours to keep the cabin livable. She had been thinking about how to ask for 4 days. She had considered and discarded several approaches. The casual mention, the indirect question, the careful professional distance of someone who was merely curious, rather than someone who had been turning 9 names over in her mind like stones. In the end, she simply asked, because she had come to understand that indirection with this particular man was a form of dishonesty, and dishonesty was something she had used up her tolerance for in Boston. The notebook, she said, the names. He was at the table with a piece of harness leather he was stitching back together, working the curved needle through the thick hide with the same deliberate attention he gave to everything his hands did. He did not look up immediately. He finished the stitch he was on. Then he set the leather down and folded his hands on the table and looked at her. "You looked at it," he said. "I opened it by accident and read more than I should have before I put it back," she said. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know." He was quiet for a moment, regarding her with those gray eyes that she had learned over these weeks to read more accurately than she had initially thought possible. There was no anger in them. There was something more complicated than anger, a complex of things that included a question she could not quite identify. "Aldridge," he said finally, "you read his." "Yes. He was from a town called Millfield. His sister's name was May. He could tell a wood thrush from a hermit thrush in the dark just from the call." He looked at his hands. He used to do it as a party trick around the campfire. The other men would bet against him, and he would win every time. A pause. He was 20 years old. He had never been west of the Ohio River. She waited. "I started writing them down in '66, he said, "the year after the war. I was in Colorado by then, working my father's cattle. I realized I was beginning to forget details, small things. The way DeLuca laughed, which was too loud, and always at the wrong moment. The way Harrington folded his letters before he put them in his coat, always 3 folds, always exactly the same. He picked up the leather again, not to work it, just to have something in his hands. When you forget a man's details, you lose the man. You keep the fact of him, but not the person." He turned the leather over. "The notebook is so I don't lose the persons." She thought about this for a moment, the specific quality of it, what it meant to spend 17 years maintaining a record of 9 men's particularities, not their deaths, but their habits, not what the war took, but what they had been before it took them. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "You gave an order based on information you were given. The information was wrong. That is not the same as what you believe it is. I know the difference between a military error and a moral one," he said. His voice was not sharp, just definitive, the voice of someone who has thought about this more than she has and arrived at a conclusion. "You can be responsible for a thing without being culpable for it. The law would not hold me accountable. I understand the law's position. But Aldridge is still dead. DeLuca is still dead. All 9 of them are still dead, and I am sitting in Montana stitching a harness because I survived and they did not. And that is a thing I carry, regardless of the law's position on it." She did not argue with this. She had been going to. She had the argument assembled reasonable and well-intentioned and probably useless, and she recognized its uselessness in the moment before she delivered it. Instead, she said, "Is that why you're building the school?" He looked at the fire. "There are 9 of them," he said. "There are 9 children in this valley who have no access to a school." She had understood this already in the moment at the lintel that morning in the snow, but hearing him say it made it different, more specific. more real. She sat with it for a moment. 14 children in the valley, she said. You said 14. 9 without the Holt children and the 2 Garrities. The Holts and Garrities can get to town in good weather. The others can't. He looked up. 9 who have no access. The fire needed a log. She got up and put one on and stayed by the hearth with her hand on the mantel, looking into the flames. Behind her, she could hear him pick up the harness leather again and resume his stitching. I found the school before I found the notebook, she said. I want you to know that. She turned around. He was looking at her. I understood what you were doing before I knew why. The why makes it make more sense. But it was already something before I knew, Che. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the leather, but his hands had stilled on it. You're not what I expected, he said, when Birch told me you were from Boston. What did you expect? The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but adjacent to one a movement in that direction. Someone who would last 3 weeks, he said. She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes before you decide whether to have it, and it surprised her, and she thought it surprised him because he looked up, and this time the thing near his mouth went a step further before he controlled it. I have disappointed you, she said. No, he said. He went back to the leather. You haven't. December came in on the heels of November without much ceremony. The days shortened to a gray brevity that made the mornings feel like extended twilight, and the afternoons feel like evening, and the snow that fell now did not melt between storms, but accumulated, building the landscape into a different version of itself, softer and more demanding, and entirely without apology. Drum's man came back on a Tuesday. This time it was not Hargrove with his town coat and his patient smile. This time it was 2 men, both of them. The kind of men whose profession was visible in the way they wore their coats and held their shoulders, and one of them carried a leather satchel from which he produced a sheaf of papers with the satisfied deliberateness of someone presenting an argument they considered unanswerable. Caleb received them in the yard again in the specific way he received people he did not want in his house, with a stillness that was not quite a threat, but occupied the same territory. These are documents from the county records office in Billings, the man with the satchel said. He had a city voice, clipped and precise. They establish that a portion of the land you currently occupy under deed was subject to a prior claim filed in 1870 by a Mr. Augustus Crane. Mr. Drum has acquired that prior claim and is prepared to present it for adjudication. Caleb looked at the papers without touching them. Crane's claim was rejected by the territorial court in 72, he said. The rejection is on file in the same office those papers came from. The rejection is under review, the man said. By whom? By the district court in Billings. At whose request? A pause. Mr. Drum has certain standing in the district court. Nora was on the porch. She had come out when she heard voices, and she stood at the porch rail with her arms folded against the cold, and watched and listened and felt something move through her that was part anger and part recognition. She had seen this before. Not the specific geography of it, not the Montana land and the water rights and the territorial court, but the mechanism of it. The way a document became a weapon when the man holding it had purchased the adjudicating body. She had stood in Edmund Pierce's office doorway and watched this exact mechanism at work on a smaller scale with different victims toward the same end. The rejection document, she said. Both men and Caleb looked at her. She came down the porch steps into the yard. The court's rejection of the Crane claim in 72. You have a copy of it in your deed records. Caleb looked at her steadily. In the strong box, he said. Yes. She turned to the man from Drum. Then whatever review is occurring in Billings is operating on an incomplete record, she said, in the tone she used with the older students when they presented an answer that was not wrong but was not yet right. The tone that said, I can see what you were attempting, but we have more work to do. A prior claim that was formally rejected by the territorial court cannot be reactivated without the rejecting court's records being part of the review. I would suggest that before Mr. Drum expends further legal resources, someone verify whether those records were included in the filing. She paused. I would also suggest that Mr. Drum's attorneys are aware of this already and are hoping you are not. The man with the satchel looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation. He looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He looked back at Nora. I'll convey your position to Mr. Drum, he said, and put the papers back in the satchel. When they had ridden out, Caleb turned and looked at her in the flat winter light of the yard. She became aware that this look was somewhat different from his usual assessment of her, that it had a different quality, less appraisal, and more something she could not immediately categorize. Edmund Pierce did something similar, she said. The man I was engaged to, in Boston. He used filed documents and friendly judges. She looked at the road where the men had gone. I spent enough time adjacent to it to understand how it works. You've been writing letters, he said. She looked at him. Tom mentioned you gave him something for the post 3 weeks ago, he said. And something again last week. I wrote to a clerk I know in the county records office in Boston, she said. He has contacts in Billings. I asked him to locate the territorial court's rejection of the Crane claim and have a certified copy sent here. She met his gaze. I did it without asking you because I thought you would tell me it wasn't my concern. It isn't your concern, he said. No, she agreed. I did it anyway. He stood in the cold yard and looked at her for a long moment, and she stood in the cold yard and looked back at him, and the wind moved between them, carrying the smell of snow and pine. Then he said, "Thank you," and turned and went to the barn. And she went inside and stood at the kitchen window and pressed her cold hands flat on the warm stove, and felt her heart doing something she would have preferred it not to do. That night, for the first time, she heard nothing from the north pasture after dark. No hammering, no sawing, nothing. She lay in her room and listened to the silence where the sounds usually were, and after a while she understood that he was not working, but sitting somewhere in the dark, the way people sit when something has shifted and they are deciding what to do about it. She lay in the dark herself, deciding the same thing, and arrived at no conclusions that did not terrify her slightly, and eventually slept. The fire started at 2:30 on a Thursday morning in the second week of December. She woke to the smell of it before she heard anything, the specific aggressive smell of burning wood that is not contained, not fireplace wood or stove wood, but something wrong, something outside the architecture of safe combustion. She was out of her bed and at her window in the 3 seconds it took her to process what the smell meant. Through the glass, she could see the orange glow at the far end of the barn, concentrated at the corner where the hay storage was already too high and too bright for something that had just started. She was out the back door in her coat over her nightgown and her boots unlaced before she had decided to move. The cold hit her and she ran. The snow was hard and crusted, and she broke through it with each step, the cold air tearing at her lungs. She could hear the fire now. The sound it made was not the sound of a campfire or a hearth, but something more urgent and less controlled. A sound with appetite in it. She could see the horses in the paddock beside the barn, agitated, moving in tight, frightened circles. One of them was Ida, moving more slowly than the others, the foal pressed against her side. Caleb was already there. He had gone out faster than her, or had perhaps not been asleep. He had the barn door open and was inside, and she could hear him talking to the horses in the even deliberate voice he used with them, not urgent, but present something to follow in the dark and smoke. She grabbed the nearest water bucket hanging on the fence post. The emergency bucket she had noticed there weeks ago and now understood, and ran to the trough. The trough had a skim of ice on it. She broke it with her elbow and filled the bucket and ran toward the barn. She was not strong enough to do what she wanted to do, which was enough, which was douse the corner of the barn that was burning before it took the rest. The bucket was heavy, and her arms were not built for this, and the snow kept breaking under her, and she poured what she had on the base of the flames, and it made a sound like a complaint, and not much else. Caleb came out with 2 of the horses, 1 in each hand, the enormous controlled urgency of a man moving fast without running, talking to the animals without pausing, getting them to the far paddock gate, and through it. He came back for the 3rd horse, and then for Ida and the foal patient, and fast at the same time, the foal confused and trembling Ida following him without needing to be led. Tom Holt appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, shirtless and running, and then the 2 other ranch hands behind him, and someone brought shovels, and someone else brought more buckets, and they worked the fire from 3 sides, throwing snow as much as water. And the fire was bad, but the barn was new green lumber, and it fought back. And the corner where it had started was the corner with the least hay in it, which later she would understand was not an accident of placement, but a function of where the fire had been set. It took 40 minutes to bring it down to smoking ruin rather than living flame. 40 minutes of cold and smoke and effort, and when it was over, they stood in the ruined corner of the barn in the gray pre-dawn light, and coughed and breathed and looked at what remained. Tom crouched at the origin point of the fire and looked at the wood there, what was left of it. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he said quietly to Caleb, "Oil-soaked rags under the corner post." He looked up. "Somebody set this." Caleb said nothing. His face was entirely still, in the way that his face was still when he was not expending effort on expression, because he was expending all available resources on something else. Nora stood in the ruined corner of the barn in her coat over her nightgown, with her hair loose around her shoulders, and her hands black with smoke, and her boots soaked through with snow and melt water. And she was not cold, or she was cold, but it did not register because something else was registering. She was looking at Caleb. He was looking at the oil-soaked wood under the corner post. Then he looked up, and he looked at her. She did not know what he saw. She knew what she saw in him, which was the specific expression of a man in whom several things are happening at once, and only some of them are visible. He looked at her standing there in the smoke and the gray light, and something moved through his face that was complicated and swift, and then went somewhere behind his eyes, and the stillness came back. "Go inside," he said. His voice was low and rough from the smoke. "In a minute," she said. "Now." There was something in the word that was different from his usual bluntness, tighter and less settled. "Please." She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him in the yard talking to Tom. Their voices too low to hear. And she put the kettle on because it was something to do, something purposeful, and warm, and domestic. And she pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and thought about oil-soaked rags under a corner post and a man named Silas Drum who sat in a warm study somewhere below the mountain. He came in an hour later. She had coffee on the table, 2 cups, and she had changed out of her ruined nightgown and put her hair up, and she was sitting at the table with her hands around her cup in the posture of someone who has been sitting there long enough to have stopped pretending to be doing anything else. He sat down across from her. He did not touch the coffee. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and she could see the smoke in the creases of his knuckles and a small burn on the back of his left hand he had not mentioned and was apparently not going to mention. "Tom says it was set," she said. "Yes. Drum's men. Likely." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Tom's riding to town in the morning to talk to the deputy." He looked up. "The rejection document from Boston came last week." Tom picked it up. "I have it in the strongbox. That, combined with evidence of arson, is enough to go to the territorial circuit judge rather than the district court in Billings. Drum doesn't own the circuit judge." She nodded. This was good. This was the right move, methodical and sound. She recognized the thinking behind it, the same quality of mind that had built a school for 4 years in secret, patient, and deliberate, and without shortcuts. "Good," she said. He nodded. He looked at the coffee. He did not pick it up. He looked at the table, then at the window, then at a point somewhere between the two. And she watched him making some interior decision and not arriving at it. Nora. He said her name the way she had come to recognize, without the careful distance of the early weeks, just her name, direct and certain. She looked at him. His jaw was tight. His eyes were on the middle distance. When the barn was burning, he stopped. He started again. When I came outside and you were there. He stopped again. She waited. I have seen. He paused. He was choosing each word with the deliberateness of a man for whom words were expensive, and imprecision was a form of failure. In the war, people in situations that ended badly, people who were in the wrong place because someone else's choices put them there. He looked at her now directly. I will not have you be one of those people. She understood what he was saying. She understood it more completely than he perhaps intended understood, that it was not just a statement about tonight, or about Drum's arson, or about her safety in a practical sense, but about something older and heavier that he carried. About 9 names in a notebook, and a decision on a hillside in Tennessee, and 17 years of a specific variety of self-imposed exile. She opened her mouth to say something careful and measured and honest. He said, "You should go back to Boston." The words landed in the room with the particular weight of something that has been held for a long time before being released. She looked at him. He was looking at the table again. "When spring comes," he said, "when the pass opens. You've done what you contracted to do. The school is almost finished. Birch can find another teacher." He moved the coffee cup slightly on the table an inch to the left without apparent purpose. "You didn't come here for this. The cold and the isolation and Drum and whatever else he's planning. You came here to start over, and you've done that. You can take that with you. You don't have to stay and see what comes next." She sat across the table from him in the gray morning light, with the smell of smoke still in her hair and her hand still holding the cup, and she felt the specific quality of a person taking something apart that they have spent considerable time building, and she understood in the way you understand things that are happening in front of you even when you wish they were not, that he was not telling her to go because he wanted her to go. He was telling her to go because he was afraid of what would happen if she stayed. She understood the architecture of this fear. She had seen its foundations in a notebook of 9 names, and its walls in the building he had made alone for 4 years, and its roof in the single sentence he had said to her in the snow, "2 men came back." She understood all of it, and she set her cup down and stood up from the table, and said in a voice that was steady because she made it steady, "I will keep that in mind." She went to her room and closed the door and sat on the edge of her bed in the gray light and looked at the wall and did not cry because crying felt like the wrong response to a man who was afraid rather than unkind. And because she was angry not at him, but at the specific mechanisms of damage, at what fear does to people over time, at what war does. At what 17 years of a particular kind of loneliness does to a person's ability to believe they are allowed to stop being lonely. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall for a long time. Then she began quietly and methodically to think about what she was going to do. She left before he was up. She had packed what she needed the night before methodically, and without drama, the things a person needs for a week away from their primary residence, rather than the things a person packs when they are leaving for good. She made this distinction deliberately, held it clearly in her mind as she folded her second wool skirt and laid her lesson plans on top of them in the valise. She was not leaving. She was removing herself from a situation that had become for both of them too compressed, too close, too charged with things that had nowhere to go in the small space of a single room with a single hearth. She left a note on the table. It said, "I am staying with Mrs. Aldenvale in town while I consider your suggestion. The school materials are in the trunk. The foal needs the mash twice daily. The recipe is on the shelf above the stove. She signed it with her name, her full name, Nora Calloway, the name she had arrived with. Before the winter and the school, and the notebook and the barn and the cold kitchen mornings with the cups of coffee already poured. Tom drove her down the mountain in the wagon before first light, the runners cutting through the crusted snow in the silence of a morning that had not yet decided what it was going to be. Tom did not ask questions which she appreciated. He drove with his hat pulled down against the cold and his eyes on the road, and he did not speak until they were through the pass and the town was visible below them in the valley, wood smoke rising from its chimneys in the still air. "He's not good at people," Tom said, "in case you hadn't noticed." "I had noticed," she said. "He was better before." Tom kept his eyes on the road. "Before the war, I mean. I didn't know him then, but his father's foreman did, worked with my father once on the Colorado Drive. Said Caleb was different then, said the war did what wars do." He paused. "He's been up on that mountain 7 years, and nobody's gotten through the door. You got further than most." She looked at the mountains behind them, the Beartooth Range, white and enormous. In the early light, the upper peaks catching the first color of sunrise, a faint rose and gold that made them look briefly like something other than what they were. "He told me to leave," she said. "I know," Tom said. "He's going to regret it approximately the moment he finds that note." She said nothing. "He built that school," Tom said. 4 years he built that school, before you came, before there was any teacher or any prospect of one. He pulled the reins slightly to guide the horses around a drift that had crossed the road. Man who builds a school alone for 4 years on a mountain because he thinks children deserve one is not a man without something worth getting to. He glanced at her sidelong. "Just thought I'd mention it. Oy. You're very eloquent for someone who claimed not to ask questions," she said. Tom smiled the easy, uncomplicated smile of someone young enough to find the situation more interesting than painful. "I didn't ask any questions," he said. "I just talked." Mrs. Aldenvale was a widow of 62, who had been in Harlan Creek since before there was a Harlan Creek, or so she implied, and who kept a spare room in her house on the east side of town for exactly the situations that frontier life produced, with regularity situations in which someone needed a place to be that was not where they had been. She asked Nora no questions either, which suggested a community that had collectively decided that privacy was a form of currency worth maintaining. And she put Nora's valise in the small room off the kitchen and set a plate of cold biscuits on the table and poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her. "You'll want the front parlor for your lessons," she said. "Good light from the east window in the morning. I'll move my sewing chair." "Thank you," Nora said. "Birch will want to know you're in town," Mrs. Aldenvale said. "He's been anxious about the school progress. I'll tell him you're here, if you like, save you the trip." "I can tell him myself," Nora said. Mrs. Aldenvale looked at her with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who had seen a great deal and filed most of it away for later. "Of course you can," she said, and poured more coffee into a cup that was not yet empty, which Nora understood as a form of kindness. She spent 3 days at Mrs. Aldenvale's house. She taught her students in the front parlor with its east light in the mornings, and she sat with her lesson planning in the afternoons, and she ate Mrs. Aldenvale's cooking at the table in the kitchen, and she did not look up the road toward the pass more than was reasonable. She wrote 2 letters. One to the county circuit judge in Helena, laying out the arson and the fraudulent document situation in clean, precise language, and one to her clerk contact in Boston, confirming receipt of the certified copy of the court rejection and asking him to stand ready to provide a sworn statement if required. On the evening of the 3rd day, she was sitting by the parlor window with a book she was not reading when she heard a horse on the main street. She did not look up immediately. She told herself this was because she was reading, which she was not, and then she looked up anyway because the sound of the horse had stopped in front of Mrs. Aldenvale's house. It was not Caleb. It was Tom, and he swung down from his horse and tied it to the post and came up the porch steps and knocked, and when Mrs. Aldenvale let him in, He came to the parlor door and stood there with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone delivering information they have been asked to deliver but would have preferred to keep to themselves. "Drum's man Hargrove went to the town hall this morning," Tom said. "Talked to Birch. Said Drum is filing an injunction to halt construction on the school building on the grounds that it's on contested land." He turned his hat in his hands. "Birch sent word up to the ranch. Caleb rode down this afternoon. He's at the deputy's office now." She set her book down. "Is the injunction legitimate?" "Hargrove says it comes from the district court in Billings. Same Judge Drum owns." Tom looked at his hat. "It would halt the school. Legally, if they can tie the land up in court for long enough, it doesn't matter whether Drum wins in the end. The school doesn't get used, the teacher's contract lapses, the whole thing just sits there until there's nothing left to fight about." She stood up. She went to the hook by the door and took her coat. "Where is the deputy's office?" "Yes." "2 doors down from the post office," Tom said. "But Miss Calloway Caleb is." He paused, searching for the word. "He's not in the best frame of mind right now." "When has he ever been?" she said and put her coat on. The deputy's office was a single room with a potbelly stove and 2 chairs and a desk and a gun rack, and the specific smell of an official space that had absorbed many conversations and released none of them. Deputy Crane was a lean, practical man of 40 who had the bearing of someone who had chosen his profession because he believed in it rather than because it was available. And he sat behind his desk with a file folder in front of him that he had clearly been studying with some intensity before Nora came through the door. Caleb was standing at the window. He turned when the door opened. Something moved through his expression when he saw her, something complicated and quickly organized into stillness. Deputy Crane looked from Caleb to Nora and back again with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned that the most useful thing he could do in many situations was maintain a consistent expression. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Deputy," she said. She came to the desk and set her coat on the chair. "I have a letter here for the circuit judge in Helena." She put the letter on the desk. "And I understand you have a copy of the territorial court's rejection of the Crane land claim from 1872. "I do," Crane said. He looked at the letter. "Caleb brought it down this afternoon along with Tom Holt's statement about the origin of the fire." "Then you have what you need to go over the district court," she said. "The injunction from Billings has to be reviewed by the circuit court if the underlying claim is contested. Drum knows this. He's counting on the process taking long enough that it doesn't matter." She looked at the file. "How quickly can you get a writer to Helena?" "Weather permitting, 5 days," Crane said. "Then the writer needs to go tomorrow morning," she said, "before Drum's lawyers file anything additional." Crane looked at Caleb. Caleb was still at the window. He was looking at her with that expression she could not name, the one she had first seen when she had stood in the school and turned around and found him in the doorway. "She's right," Caleb said. His voice was level. "Send the writer tomorrow." Crane nodded and began making notes. Nora sat in the chair across from the desk, and they went through the documentation, all of it, the sequence of events from Hargrove's first visit to the arson, to the injunction organizing it into the shape that a circuit court judge would find legible and persuasive. It took 2 hours. Caleb sat eventually in the second chair and contributed when Crane asked him direct questions, and the 3 of them worked through it with the focused, cooperative efficiency of people who understood that the work was what mattered and that the work required their complete attention. When Crane finally sat back and said he had what he needed, Nora put her coat back on and stood. Caleb stood as well. They went out into the street together and stopped on the boardwalk in the cold night air. The main street of Harlan Creek was quiet, the lamplight from the saloon at the far end making an orange rectangle on the snow, 2 horses at the rail in front of the general store. Above them, the sky was very clear and very full of stars, the specific extravagance of stars that you see only at altitude, where there is nothing between you and the full inventory of what is up there. He stood beside her on the boardwalk and looked at the street. She waited. "I found the note," he said. I assumed you would." He put his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at the street. He looked at the stars. He looked at the side of the general store across from them, which offered nothing in particular, but was apparently preferable to looking at her. She had learned over these weeks that there were things he could say into a middle distance that he could not say into a face. And she had learned the courtesy of offering him the middle distance when he needed it. She looked at the street also. "The foal is doing well," he said. "Good," she said. A pause. "She follows Ida everywhere. Ida's very patient with her." Another pause. "I named her." She waited. "Clara," he said. He said it the way you say a name that is new to you, carefully making sure it fits correctly in the mouth. "Tom said it was a good name, I thought." He stopped. "I thought you might want to know." She looked at the stars above the mountains. Clara. A good name. Simple and clear and certain of itself. She thought about a man who had spent 4 years building something alone, and who named a foal, with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom names mattered, who wrote names in notebooks and carved names into lintels. "It is a good name," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her directly, which he did less often than you might expect from someone she had spent 11 weeks in close proximity to, and when he did it meant something specific. "I said things I should not have said," he said. She met his gaze. "You said things you believed." "I said things I believed because I was afraid," he said. He said the word afraid the way someone says a word in a language they are not comfortable in but are committed to using correctly. That is not the same as them being true. She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and direct, and with the particular expression she had first been unable to name, and could now name, which was the expression of a man looking at something he had been trying not to want for long enough that the effort had become structural and was now brick by brick coming down. "What I said about you going back to Boston," he said. "That was about me, not about you." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway because it needs to be said out loud." She waited. "I have not." He stopped. He started again. The street was quiet. A horse at the general store shifted its weight, and the harness jingled once. "For a long time I have managed well enough on my own. I had what I needed, the work and the land and the animals and the—" He paused. "And then you arrived, and you were not what I expected in any respect, and I did not know what to do with that." He looked at his boots for a moment. "I still don't know what to do with that, but sending you away is not it. I understand that now." She stood on the boardwalk in the cold night air and looked at this man who had spent 17 years punishing himself for a decision that the law had already acquitted him of, who had built a school in secret for 4 years on a mountain because he could not think of another way to address what he felt he owed the world, who had named a foal Clara in the 3 days she was gone and had thought she might want to know. She thought about what Tom had said in the wagon coming down the mountain. Man who builds a school alone for 4 years is not a man without something worth getting to. "I'm not going back to Boston," she said. He looked at her. "My contract is through April," she said, "and the school is not finished, and the circuit court case is going to take time, and someone needs to be here who understands the documentation." She paused. "And Clara needs someone who is not Tom to take an interest in her development." The corner of his mouth moved. "Clara," he said, "has Tom completely managed. Tom has enough to do," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the starlight, this careful, deliberate, difficult man, and she looked back at him, and the cold was significant, and the street was quiet, and somewhere in the mountains above them, a wolf called once into the dark, a long ascending note that the silence swallowed completely. "Will you come back up the mountain, Thor?" he said. It was not precisely a question. It was not precisely a statement. It was something in between, a thing offered carefully with both hands, the way you offer something breakable. She considered making him wait. She considered the merits of allowing the moment to breathe, of not answering immediately, of letting him experience briefly the specific quality of not knowing. She decided against it. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, the sound of something that had been held for several days being released. He looked at the street. He looked at the stars. He looked at the mountains above the town, white and enormous and patient. "I'll get the wagon," he said. "It's late," she said. "I'll come up in the morning." He looked at her, and she thought she saw briefly the thing that was near his mouth go further than it had gone before, further than adjacent to a smile, briefly becoming the thing itself, warm and unguarded and entirely uncontrolled, before he organized it back into his customary expression. "Morning," he said. He went to get his horse. She stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, and then looked up at the stars above the Beartooth Range. The full, extravagant inventory of them, more than a person raised in a city ever really believes, is up there, until they are standing under them in the cold dark of a Montana winter, and she thought about the morning, and about a school with a name carved into its lintel, and about a notebook with 9 names that deserved to be remembered, and about a foal named Clara, learning the sound of her own name. And she breathed in the cold, clean air and felt for the first time since she had stepped off a stage in a town smaller than she had expected precisely and completely where she was supposed to be. She went back to Mrs. Aldenvale's house and told her she would be leaving in the morning, and Mrs. Aldenvale said, "Of course you will," and poured her a cup of tea, and they sat at the kitchen table in the warm lamplight and did not talk about anything in particular, which was exactly right. The circuit court rider left Harlan Creek on a Friday morning in the gray pre-dawn cold, his saddlebags carrying 3 documents that Nora had spent 2 evenings organizing into the precise order she believed would be most persuasive to a judge who had not yet been told what to think about Silas Drum. The first document was the certified copy of the Territorial Court's rejection of the Crane land claim dated June 1872, bearing the territorial seal and the signature of the presiding judge, whose name was not the name of the judge currently sitting in Billings at Drum's convenience. The second was Deputy Crane's sworn statement regarding the physical evidence of arson at the Rourke Ranch, including Tom Holt's testimony about the oil-soaked rags and the origin point of the fire. The third was Nora's own letter to the circuit judge, 4 pages of clean, precise prose, laying out the sequence of events from Hargrove's first visit to the fraudulent injunction. The kind of letter written by someone who understood how documents worked and how the misuse of them worked, and how to make that misuse legible to someone with the authority to address it. She had included at the end of the letter 1 paragraph she had written and rewritten 4 times before she was satisfied with it. It said, "The land in question has been occupied, developed and maintained in good faith by Mr. Caleb Rourke for 7 years. During that time, Mr. Rourke has, at his own expense and labor, constructed a school building on his property for the benefit of the children of the Harlan Creek Valley who cannot access the town school in winter months. This fact is relevant to the character of the occupant and the nature of the dispute, and I submit it for the court's consideration alongside the documentary record." She did not tell Caleb she had included this paragraph. She thought he would find it unnecessary, which it was technically legally in terms of the purely evidentiary record. She included it anyway because she believed the circuit judge was a person rather than a function, and that persons were sometimes moved by things that were not strictly required. The writer went. They waited. Life on the ranch in the weeks after her return had the quality of something that had been reorganized. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been visible to someone who had not been present for the gradual rearrangement that had preceded it, but in ways that were specific and real, and that both of them navigated with the careful attention of people who understood that the thing they were building was more fragile in its early stages than it would eventually be, and that fragile things require care. The mornings continued as they had before she left with the coffee already poured when she came out with the biscuits or the cornbread or the oatmeal she made before he came in from the early feeding with the small geometry of two people sharing a kitchen that was sized for one. But now there was something additional in the mornings, a quality of ease that had not been there before. As though some underlying tension had been resolved and the space it had occupied was now available for something less effortful. He looked at her in the mornings now without the careful monitoring of a man deciding how much to reveal. She looked at him without the careful management of a woman deciding how much to ask. They talked, not constantly, not in the way of people who fill silence, because silence makes them uneasy, but in the way of people who have things to say and say them when they arise. He told her about his father's ranch in Colorado, about the specific quality of the light there in the summer. Different from Montana light, more golden, more generous. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12, and about the way she had learned to cook from watching and trying rather than being taught, which explained. She said certain idiosyncrasies in her approach to biscuits. He told her that her biscuits were fine. She told him she knew they were fine. She was explaining the idiosyncrasies, not apologizing for them. He said he had not asked for an apology. She said she was aware of that. These were not important conversations. They were the conversations that happen around the edges of the important ones, that make the important ones possible, that build the ordinary foundation that everything else rests on. He finished the school roof on a Tuesday in January with Tom's help and the help of the two ranch hands, all four of them up on the rafters in the cold, dry air of a clear winter day. Laying the boards and the sod over them with the organized speed of men who understood that weather in Montana did not wait for completion and had learned to complete things before it arrived. Nora brought coffee and food out to them at midday and stood in the snow looking up at the roof and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the roof itself did not already say more clearly. When it was done, Caleb came down from the ladder and stood beside her, and they looked at the building together in the afternoon light, complete now, solid and square, against the mountain backdrop, the name on the lintel clear above the door. "It needs desks," he said. "I know," she said. "I've written to a supplier in Billings." He looked at her sidelong. "Before the injunction," she said. "I wrote before the injunction. You were ordering desks before the injunction was resolved." "The injunction was going to be resolved," she said. "I was planning ahead." He was quiet for a moment. "How many desks?" 14, she said, 1 for each child. He looked at the school. He looked at the lintel. He said nothing, but she felt the quality of his silence, which she had by now learned to read as accurately as speech, and what it said was something she did not try to put into words, because some things are more themselves when they are left to be what they are without the imposition of language. The response from the circuit court came on a Thursday in the first week of February, carried by a rider who had made the journey from Helena in 4 days on good horses and decent roads, and the particular motivation of a man who had been told his errand was urgent. Deputy Crane sent Tom up to the ranch with the news before he sent anyone else anywhere, which Nora thought well of him for. Tom arrived at the ranch in the early afternoon, his horse breathing hard from the pace he had set, and he swung down in the yard and came to the porch where Nora was working on her lesson planning in the thin winter sunshine, wrapped in 2 shawls, and a determination that outdoor work was still possible in temperatures above 15 degrees. "Circuit judge ruled," Tom said. He was grinning in the wide, uncomplicated way of someone delivering genuinely good news to people who have earned it. "Drum's injunction is dismissed. The territorial court rejection from 72 stands. The Crane claim is dead officially and on the record." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "There's more." Judge referred the arson evidence to the territorial marshal's office in Helena. Drum's lawyers are apparently already in a great deal of difficulty explaining their client's involvement in the filing of documents they knew to be fraudulent. Nora set her lesson planning down. Drum. Tom continued, still grinning. Is, as of this morning, a man with serious legal problems and no judge in his pocket to help with them. He held out the paper. Crane said to give this to Caleb directly, but Caleb's in the north pasture and I thought you'd want to know first. She took the paper. She read it. It was a copy of the circuit court's ruling, 4 pages of precise legal language that said in its various formal ways the same thing Tom had just said in 2 sentences. She read it through to the end, and then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, which was not the weight of paper, but the weight of what paper carries when it carries the right thing. "Go get Caleb," she said. Tom went. She stayed on the porch in the thin February sunshine and looked out at the valley, at the creek. Dark between its snowbanks at the cattle, small and dark in the lower pasture at the mountains, white and enormous and unchanged above everything, indifferent to the human arrangements being made and unmade in their shadow. She thought about a man named Edmund Pierce in a Boston office, and a county assessor, and a map of a neighborhood, and the sound of a door opening at the wrong moment. She thought about how the mechanism was the same, regardless of the scale. The same structure of power arranging itself to take what it wanted from people who did not have equal access to the documents that said what belonged to whom. She thought about a certified copy of a court rejection from 1872 and a clerk in Boston who owed her a professional courtesy and 4 pages of clean, precise prose to a circuit judge who turned out to be a person rather than just a function. She heard Caleb before she saw him, the sound of his horse coming up from the pasture at a pace that was faster than his usual pace, which meant Tom had told him before he reached him, probably while still at a distance, because Tom was young enough to find the delivery of good news exciting rather than something that required dignity. He came into the yard and swung down and tied the horse and came to the porch steps, and she held out the paper. He took it and read it. He read it the way he did everything, with complete attention and without hurry, and she watched his face while he read it, which was something she had learned to do, not because his face was expressive in the usual sense, but because she had learned its language, the specific vocabulary of small movements that said what his voice did not always say. His jaw unclenched degree by degree as he read. The line between his brows, which she had come to understand, was not a line of anger, but of sustained vigilance, of the specific tension of a man who had been waiting for the next difficulty and had learned to be always ready for it. That line eased slowly, the way ice eases in the first real warmth of spring, not dramatically, but definitively. The change that cannot be undone. When he finished, he lowered the paper and looked at the valley. He stood on the bottom porch step and looked at his land in the February light, and she stood on the porch and looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling. "It's over," he said. "The drum part of it," she said. "Yes." He turned and looked up at her. The February light was clean and flat and honest, and it sat on his face without any of the drama of firelight or lantern light, just the plain, clear light of a winter afternoon, and in it he looked tired and relieved. And something else, something she had been watching come closer for weeks, the way you watch a change in weather, knowing it is coming, waiting to see what form it will take when it arrives. He came up the porch steps. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the cold in the red of his cheeks and the specific gray of his eyes that she had been cataloging without meaning to since the first afternoon on the road from town. "The drama part of it," he said. He said it the way you repeat something back when you are identifying the part of it that is not what was said, the part that was left in the gap between the words. She looked at him. He reached out and took her hand. Not with the tentative quality of someone attempting something they are uncertain of, but with the deliberate, careful certainty of a man who has thought about a thing for long enough that when he does it without hesitation, because the hesitation was used up in the thinking. His hand was large and calloused and warm despite the cold air, and it held hers with a gentleness that she had first seen on the night of the foal, and that she understood now was not incidental to him, but essential, was the thing underneath. Everything else, the thing, the silence, and the stillness, and the 7 years on the mountain, had been protecting. "I am not good at this," he said. "I know," she said. "You're getting better." Something moved through his expression, that thing that went further than adjacent to a smile, and this time he did not organize it back. He kissed her in the February sunlight on the porch of his ranch house with the mountains behind him, and the school visible at the far end of the north pasture, with its name in the lintel and the new sod on its roof, and it was not a dramatic kiss. Not the kind that belongs to the moment before a battle, or the kind that carries the weight of 17 years of loneliness releasing all at once. It was the kind that says, "I am here, and I intend to continue being here," which is a different and in some ways more serious thing. And she kissed him back with the same intention, the same plainness, the same certainty that had nothing to prove, because it was simply true. When they stepped apart, Tom was very visibly looking at the mountains in the middle distance, with the focused attention of a man who had noticed something extremely interesting about the Beartooth Range that he had never noticed before, and intended to go on noticing it for as long as was necessary. Spring came to Harlan Creek the way spring came to high country everywhere, not gradually and pleasantly, but all at once, and with the specific violence of water that has been compressed into ice for 5 months and has now been released. The snowmelt came off the mountains in sheets, and the creek ran brown and fast between its banks, and the lower pasture went to mud, and the mud went to green, and then overnight, almost the green went everywhere. Up the hillsides and into the tree lines, and across the valley floor in a rolling, unstoppable wave of color that made Nora. Standing on the porch in the early April morning, in a coat she no longer quite needed, feel that she had perhaps never before understood what the word spring actually meant. The school opened on the 15th of April. The desks had arrived from Billings in the first week of the month, 14 of them in pieces, in crates that Caleb and Tom assembled on the school floor. Over 2 evenings, the sound of hammering coming from the north pasture in the early dark, in the old familiar rhythm, but different now, purposeful in a way that was completed rather than deferred. Nora had arranged them in 3 rows facing the south windows so that the children would sit in the light coming off the valley, the mountains visible beyond the glass, the creek a silver thread in the middle distance. She had put the notebook on the shelf. She had asked him first, sitting at the table one evening in March, with the notebook between them and the fire low and the ranch quiet around them. She had asked if she could put it in the school, not on the desk, not in a prominent place, but on the shelf, beside the door where it would be present without being displayed. She had said they should be in a room with children in it. He had been quiet for a long time looking at the notebook, and she had waited, because she had learned to wait, and then he had said yes. She had carried it to the school herself on the morning of the 14th and put it on the shelf beside the door with a small card she had written in her best cursive. In memory of 9 men who deserved to grow old, she did not put names on the card. The names were inside. Anyone who wanted to know the names could open the notebook and read them, and know that Aldridge could identify birds in the dark by their calls, and that DeLuca laughed too loud at the wrong moments, and that Harrington folded his letters exactly 3 times before he put them in his coat. On the morning of the 15th, she walked up to the school through the spring grass wet with dew. The mountains bright above her in the early light. Caleb was already there, standing outside the door, with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the lintel the way he sometimes looked at things he had made, with the quiet assessment of a person checking whether it still meant what they made it to mean. She came and stood beside him. "Desks are straight," he said. "I know, I straightened them. The east window has a gap in the chinking. I know, Tom is fixing it this afternoon." He looked at the lintel. He looked at her. "Are you ready?" She looked at the school. She looked at the name above the door, the careful, deliberate letters he had carved into the wood 4 years ago, when there was no teacher and no students and no certainty that any of it would come to anything, only the belief that it should exist. She thought about what it means to build something before you know who will use it, sustained by nothing more elaborate than the conviction that it is worth building. She thought about a valise and a stagecoach and a town smaller than the advertisement implied. She thought about coffee already poured. She thought about a foal named Clara and a man on the bottom porch step with a paper in his hands and his jaw unclenching degree by degree in the February light. She thought about 9 names on a shelf inside a room where children would learn to read and calculate and understand that the world was larger than the valley they were born in. Yes, she said. The children arrived in a straggling, cheerful line through the spring grass. The Holt children first because they were closest, then the Garrity siblings, then the others, some on horseback and some on foot, and the youngest. The Reeves girl who was 6 and had never been to school and was approaching it with an expression of concentrated excitement that Nora recognized as the expression of someone for whom a door is about to open. They came through the gate and across the yard and into the school one by one, and found their desks and sat down and looked up at her with the faces of people who are ready for what comes next. She looked at them. She looked at the room. The desks in 3 rows, the south windows with their view of the valley, the shelf beside the door with the notebook and its card. She looked at the door where Caleb stood in the frame, one shoulder against the wood watching. She had told him he did not need to stay. He had said he wanted to see how it began. She had understood this to mean he wanted to be present for something that was in some important sense also his. She turned to the children. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Miss Calloway. This is your school. I want to start by telling you something, and I want you to remember it for as long as you are here and after you leave." She paused. She looked at their faces, all 14 of them, the full range from the Reeves girls 6 years to Thomas Garrity's 15, all of them waiting in the April light. There is no question you can ask that is too small to be worth asking. There is no thing you do not know that you should be ashamed of not knowing. You are here to learn, and learning begins with being willing to not yet know something. That is not a weakness. That is where everything starts. What? She picked up the chalk. Outside the south windows, the valley spread below them in the spring light, green and brown and silver. The creek bright in the morning sun, the mountains white above the timberline, and the lower slopes coming into color, the first brave green of the aspens among the dark pine. A hawk turned in a long, easy arc above the far pasture, catching the thermal off the warming valley floor, riding it upward without effort in the way of things that have learned to use what the world offers. In the doorway, Caleb Rourke watched his school begin. The contract Nora Calloway had signed with the Harlan Creek School Board was for 6 months. When Alderman Birch came to the ranch in late April to discuss renewal terms, he found her in the school with a class of 14 children in the middle of a geography lesson that had somehow expanded to include a debate about the comparative merits of the Atlantic and Pacific coastlines. A debate conducted with the specific, passionate conviction of people who had seen neither. Birch waited in the yard. When she came out, he offered her a contract for the following year, same terms, and she told him she was grateful for the offer, but that she had some conditions to discuss regarding the terms. He looked at the mountains for a moment with the expression of a man bracing himself, and then said he was prepared to hear her conditions. Her conditions were 3. The first was a salary commensurate with the qualifications she held. The second was a materials budget sufficient to keep the school properly supplied without her having to manage the supply chain through personal correspondence with contacts in Boston. The third was that the boarding around arrangement to be discontinued, as she had made her own permanent housing arrangements. Birch looked at the ranch house. He looked at the north pasture where Caleb was visible working along the fence line in the spring light. He looked at Nora. "Permanent," he said. "Permanent," she said. He wrote up the new contract in the town hall the following morning, and she signed it, and he shook her hand with the expression of a man who had come to accept that the world continued to arrange itself in ways he had not anticipated, and that there was very little to be done about this except to proceed accordingly. The question Caleb had asked her on the road back from Mrs. Aldenvale's house in the February dark had been answered some time before. Birch arrived with his contract answered in the specific way that things are answered between two people who have been building toward something for long enough that when it is finally built, it is recognizable to both of them. Not as a new thing, but as the thing that was always taking shape, that needed only time and the right weather to become what it had been becoming all along. He had asked her one evening in March, standing in the kitchen after supper with the dishes done and the fire banked for the night, and the ranch quiet around them, and the notebook on its shelf in the school a quarter-mile north. He had asked her not with any ceremony, and not with anything that required a long answer in the direct, careful way he did everything. Looking at her across the kitchen, with his hands at his sides, and the expression that was no longer complicated, because it had resolved itself, settled into something simpler and more certain. She had said yes in the same spirit, direct and certain, and without requiring anything more elaborate than the truth. The Reverend in Harlan Creek married them in the church on the last Saturday in March, with Tom Holt as witness, and Mrs. Aldenvale in the front pew with an expression of deep personal satisfaction that she made no effort to conceal. The ceremony was brief and entirely sufficient, and afterward Tom shook Caleb's hand with the kind of force that communicates genuine feeling in people who have not developed other methods. And Mrs. Aldenvale held both of Nora's hands in hers and said simply, "Good," which was exactly the right word for it. They walked back up the mountain in the late afternoon light of a March day that had almost convinced itself it was April. The snow soft and giving underfoot the creek running fast and brown with melt, the first red osier showing color along the banks. They walked through the gate and past the school with its name in the lintel, and across the yard and onto the porch. And Caleb held the door, and she went in, and the fire was laid and waiting, and the lamps were lit, and the cabin was warm, and she stood in the center of the room that was not a prison of isolation or a temporary arrangement or a bargain made out of desperation, but simply home. And she felt the word settle into her the way the right word settles when you find it after a long search, with the specific relief of something that fits. On the shelf in the school, the notebook waited with its 9 names. In the spring to come, 14 children would learn to read and argue and ask questions too small to be worth asking, and find out they were not too small at all. In the north pasture, Clara was growing into her legs with the confident inelegance of something that did not yet know its own strength. The mountains stood above the valley, as they had stood for 10,000 years, indifferent and enormous and very beautiful, and the creek ran down from them with the water that was no longer anyone's weapon, but only water moving in its old channel toward the valley below. And in the cabin, at the end of the north road in the Harlan Creek Valley, a woman who had come to a place smaller than she expected to start over, found that starting over was not the right name for what had happened to her. The right name was something closer to arriving, to finding. After a long journey on a road that was sometimes iced over and sometimes too narrow and sometimes darker than she would have chosen, the place she had been heading toward all along, without knowing it, without being able to name it until she was standing in it, and it was unmistakably, entirely, and without qualification home. Outside, the last of the winter light moved down the mountain in a long, slow wave of gold, and the hawks rode their thermals in the cooling air, and the valley held its breath for one clear moment before evening, as valleys do, as though taking account of everything it contained before the dark, and finding it on this particular evening, in this particular spring, more than sufficient.